It was a quiet town, a place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. But that night, something changed. The air felt heavier, the streets darker, and the wind carried a whisper, a sound so faint, yet so unsettling. Emily had just moved into an old house on the outskirts. The rent was cheap, too cheap. She should have questioned it. The house had a history, one that people chose to forget. But she didn't believe in ghost stories. Not yet. The first night was uneventful, but the second, everything changed. As she lay in bed, the air around her turned cold, unnaturally cold. A faint scratching sound echoed through the hallway. She dismissed it, blaming the wind. But then, the scratching turned into knocking, soft at first, then louder, more urgent. She hesitated before getting up. With each step toward the door, the sound grew closer. She held her breath, gripping the doorknob, and opened it slowly. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick, suffocating. A whisper, almost too soft to hear, brushed against her ear. "You shouldn't be here." She turned around sharply, her heart pounding. No one was there. The darkness seemed to press against her, watching. She closed the door and locked it, but the whispers continued. Sleepless and restless, she decided to investigate the next day. She asked the neighbors about the house, but their faces turned pale. They avoided her eyes, muttering excuses before walking away. An old woman finally spoke. That house, it belonged to the Hollow Man. He never left. That night, Emily heard the whispers again. But this time, they weren't alone. Footsteps echoed through the house. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. Her breath hitched as she saw the door creak open on its own. A shadow loomed in the darkness, its shape shifting unnaturally. She wanted to run, but her body refused to move. The shadow stepped closer, revealing a figure, tall, hollow-eyed, its mouth twisted in a grin too wide for a human. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered again, this time in a voice that was both distant and painfully close. Emily screamed, stumbling backward. The lights flickered violently. Shadows twisted and moved along the walls, whispering her name. She bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The thing lunged at her, its bony fingers reaching for her throat. Just as it touched her skin, everything went black. She woke up the next morning in her bed, gasping for air. Sunlight streamed through the window. It had to be a dream, but as she turned her head, her blood ran cold. The door was still open, and carved into the wood, deep and jagged, were 3 words: "See you tonight." The shadows in the room flickered. The whisper returned, and Emily knew this was only the beginning. She tried to ignore the words, but throughout the day, strange things kept happening. Objects moved on their own, the television switched channels randomly. Whispers followed her no matter where she went. The air always seemed colder, no matter how much she turned up the heat. As night approached, her anxiety grew. She kept the lights on, but they flickered as if something was trying to drain their energy. Then, at exactly midnight, the air stilled. Not a single sound came from outside, not the wind, not the insects, nothing. Then, the whispers returned, clearer this time. They spoke in hushed tones, but she could make out words. "Come downstairs, come see." Her breath hitched. She didn't want to move, but something compelled her. Step by step, she made her way down the staircase, the wood creaking beneath her. The living room was drenched in darkness except for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. Then, she saw it, the shadow, standing in the middle of the room waiting. Her body turned to ice. The figure moved forward, gliding, its face still twisted in that same unnatural grin. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered again, but this time, its voice carried weight. It was no longer a warning, it was a sentence. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room spun, and suddenly, she wasn't in her house anymore. She stood in a dark corridor, damp walls surrounding her. A single door stood in front of her, slightly ajar, a red glow seeping through the cracks. The whispers became deafening, now coming from all around her. "Open it, join us." She shook her head, trying to step back, but invisible hands pushed her forward. With trembling fingers, she reached for the doorknob. As soon as she touched it, the door burst open, revealing an abyss of swirling shadows. Faces emerged from the darkness, distorted, screaming in silent agony. The shadowy figure stood behind her now, whispering into her ear, "You are one of us now." Emily let out a blood-curdling scream, but it was swallowed by the abyss as she was pulled inside. The door slammed shut behind her. The next morning, the house was empty.